If you've never launched an app before, you might be feeling a little bit stuck trying to figure out what the 100th step is going to look like, so much so that you're finding it hard to even take the first steps. Because if you don't know what to plan for, then how can you move forward at all? This is a trap a lot of entrepreneurs fall into because when you're just starting out with something new, like launching a no-code app, you just don't know what you don't know. And so in this video, we're going to talk about how to test, validate, and automate your way to scaling your no-code app. Essentially, we're going to break down what those later stages should look like so that you can actually move through these first stages. Now, make sure you stick around until the end because we have a free template that I want you to get your hands on to help you create the roadmap for the first version of your app so that you can get it out there into users' hands. Kristen here at Coaching No Code Apps. We help non-technical entrepreneurs build custom apps so they can launch their app-based businesses or grow their existing businesses all without coding. And if you want to learn more about that, subscribe to our channel below for new videos every single week. Today, we're going to talk through a format and strategy really to help you start in these early stages with your app and your business and successfully reach the later stages where you are truly scaling your venture. Now, the way this process looks is pretty simple. When you're just thinking about it or talking about it, really you are aiming to test every single thing that you do with your development and with your messaging and marketing, so all facets, and then you're aiming to validate with actual prospective users and real users, and then you're looking to automate. Now, automate can look a lot of different ways, but essentially you test, you validate, and then you add a little bit of scale via automation in order to start scaling up and out with your app and your business. Now, again, that sounds simple in theory, but we're going to head over to the whiteboard and break this down so that you can truly understand what those later stages are going to look like with your no-code app and how to get there. On my screen here, you can see some circles that are getting bigger as we move outward, and that is representing your app and your business as a whole. So the very first stage that you're going to go through with your app is your pilot stage. Now, this is sometimes referred to in different ways. If you've heard the term MVP, which you likely have, then you can think about this as being your minimum viable product or the pilot version of your application. Really, the pilot version is just to help you validate your product. So if you are thinking about developing an app right now, or you already are currently developing your app, but you haven't launched yet, then you are in your pilot version. You have idea validation, ideally, and now you're building out the pilot version of your app to test for product validation. So in other words, you're just building the version that is going to be tested in a real life application by a user to validate that it in fact does solve the problem that it has intended to be, that it's intending to solve. Now, you're not yet trying to test for consistency or adoption or anything like that. You're just trying to make sure that you are solving the problem with your app. So you're at your pilot stage down here. Now, after you get that product validation, you're going to move into your beta stage. So we're taking a step out. We're seeing a little bit of growth because now with the beta stage, you're bringing more users on board to test for consistent adoption with your app. So if with your pilot version, you're just checking to make sure that the product does solve the problem it's intended to solve, well, the beta version is meant to solve that problem consistently, right? In real life situations on a consistent daily or however often it would be for your app on a consistent basis. So that's the beta version. And then we go up and out even more to what we are simply calling the rollout stage. So as you transition from the beta stage into the rollout stage, essentially you are just releasing your app to your broader market. So now you are finished with that initial testing, the product validation and the adoption, and now you're just rolling out the app more widely. And then from there, You focus on scale. So if you've rolled out the app more widely to your broader market, now you need to scale up and get more of that market into your app. So this is what these stages look like. So right now, you are down here, or even before that. You might not have started developing your app yet, and that's okay. But this is what it's going to look like as you build out. Now, of course, there are lots of different moving pieces within this, and we're going to break those down too. It's important to make sure that you are actually breaking up these stages as you approach them, because what I see a lot of people doing is planning out their app's development and then automatically trying to reach that upper scale stage without any stops in between. And that is a really big mistake because you're not getting those different stages of validation that you need. But more importantly, you're not learning how to add high leverage scale as you work your way up to actually scaling your product, right? In order to scale, you have to add leverage into your app, into your business, into your outreach, your marketing in different ways. But the only way you can appropriately add scale is if you work your way up incrementally. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about now. I want you to sort of look at these stages now as a ladder. Okay, so pretend like you are climbing the ladder from pilot to beta to rollout to scale. And at each, or to get up to each next rung, you have to do a couple of different things. So let me make this here so that you can see it. But essentially, what you are doing is aiming to test. Let's get a different color there so you can see it better. You're aiming to test each different component, each different rung, if you will, on this ladder, and you're looking to validate. And once you have tested and validated, you can add a component of scale. Okay, that's how we'll refer to it. And then you're going to continue to do that as you move up. So you will test and you will validate. That might be kind of hard to see, but we're putting a T and a V. And then you are going to add some scale. And then you're going to test and you're going to validate and you're going to add some scale. Okay, so that's how we're climbing the ladder here. Now, we have to understand what you're actually testing and scaling, and we're going to talk about this as it relates to both your app's development and your marketing and messaging, so you can see how these things come together with your business as a whole. Okay, so let's go through an example of what climbing that ladder would look like with your app's development. So at the very bottom rung, in your pilot stage, you are building out your app's must-have features. They must be in place in order to solve the problem that your app is intended to solve. You're building those features, and then you are testing with a pilot test group. Okay, so early access pilot test users, and you are validating that the app does solve their problem in a real life application. Now, that doesn't mean that you're validating that the app solves the problem on a consistent basis and that they can just come on board the app and go and run with it, right? That's not what we're looking at yet. Okay, so the pilot stage it's really unscalable. You're going to be putting in more work, more manual work really, and just more time in order to get the return you need, which is that validation, which is incredibly valuable. So what you're going to be doing is building out this very core product, your pilot app, and then you're going to be bringing pilot users on board and ideally having a lot of interaction with those pilot users, having conversations with them, having Zoom meetings with them, maybe meeting it with them in person depending on your app's use case. And again, you're looking for that validation. Now, the reason why I say this is unscalable is because on a large scale, you cannot have conversations like that. You know, if you have 1,000 users on board your app, you're not going to be able to sit down and have an hour-long conversation with every single one of them if you are a solo founder, right? So you're doing unscalable things, But by having those conversations, you are getting incredibly valuable information that is going to help you climb that ladder with your app. If you are doing that right down here in your pilot stage, then we have to look at now how to add a component of scale as you move up to the beta stage. Now, this is really simple. Let's say your pilot testing involves you bringing in a group of these early access pilot users and manually onboarding them into your app yourself so that you can go ahead and let them test the app, but without yet having to build out a fully automated onboarding system, right? Because that's not really relevant yet until you can actually prove that the app is solving their problem. Okay, so again, at the pilot stage here, let's say you're manually onboarding these users to let them test out your app. Now, adding an element of scale once you have achieved that product validation could just be adding on that onboarding step so that when you're doing your beta testing, which is testing for consistent adoption, you can then let your beta testers come on board themselves. Okay, so you're automating that a little bit. So again, you would be taking what you learned from the pilot stage and from those conversations that you're having and taking that feedback, and you could create an onboarding process that helps bring people into your app and orient them effectively, which you would understand how to do from having had these conversations and done it yourself. You can automate it. In other words, just set up an onboarding process that lets them go through it themselves, which adds some scalability because now you don't have to manually onboard these users in order for them to continue testing your app. You can manually do the outreach and they can come on board themselves. So now you're scaling up just a little bit. Then when you're doing your beta testing, you're testing for that consistent adoption. Well, you're still going to be interacting with your users at this stage and bringing in a lot of feedback. So it's still less scalable than you ideally want it to be, or that you have probably envisioned your app-based business being. But as you get feedback from your beta users who are consistently using your app in real life applications, you can get a really good idea of what their experience is like. So now we start to think more about user experience. We weren't really thinking about that in the pilot stage. Of course, we don't want to give people a bad experience, but we weren't thinking about making the most streamlined app possible in regard to user experience because the product validation was the important thing first. Okay, but once we're testing for consistency, all these things that relate to experience are going to start to come up from your users. You're going to learn what is maybe a little bit irritating, or what is inconvenient, or what is time consuming, or what is just keeping them from just wanting to use the app even more, right? That's the feedback you're going to get. So when you reach that rollout, or when you're working up to that rollout stage where you want to introduce your app to your wider market, well, you're going to take all of that feedback about experience. You're going to build those experience touches now into your app. So you're going to make the fixes where it's necessary. You're going to make improvements and iterations and additions for experience, and that will add a little bit of scale, because now instead of users having to reach out and ask you how to do something because they can't figure it out, and maybe they're sending in bug reports or support tickets because they can't really figure something out, when really it's just because the experience needs to be streamlined, right? So instead of you spending your time manually doing that, well, now you can make these tweaks into your app because you have the feedback, and you can add a little bit of scale, because now you're not going to be spending that time manually helping people with that. We have gone through the pilot stage, added some scale, gone through the beta stage, added some scale, and now we're in the rollout stage. And from here, you really are rolling things out. So there's not as much of a defined line or rung here as you start to scale out. Once you're in your rollout stage, you're still going to be intaking feedback, and maybe you'll still be having interviews or meetings with users, but it's not going to be every single one of them. They're no longer going to be your test users. But you always still want to seek out feedback so that you can find more and more ways to scale up your app. Now, we've talked about how figuring out what that later stage looks like for you can make it hard to move forward through the first stages because you want to plan ahead. And the template, the free template that we have that I want to share with you, that's going to help you create a roadmap for that first pilot stage. It's going to get you moving forward on the right trajectory toward the scale stage. So you'll have the initial stage mapped out, and you can start working your way out from there. And again, we'll chat more about that at the end. But first, I want to talk about now messaging, marketing, and user outreach and how that ties in with your app's development, because this can hold you back just as much as the development stages themselves. Because when you look at other companies or other entrepreneurs and they talk about the marketing strategies they're using, it might feel overwhelming. Like, how on earth can you implement something like that with your app when, number one, you are trying to handle development right now and you're learning something new there? Number two, marketing in general and sales might be brand new as well. So you're trying to learn new things there and you're trying to do it all together while all the other life stuff is going on. And you probably have a job or a business already. So how the heck do you do it? Well, we're going to talk about that as well. We're going to go through an example in the exact same way that we just did with your app's development and the types of scale components that you can add on at each stage. So again, let's start with the pilot version here. Now, when you're doing your initial user outreach at this stage, you really don't want to be thinking about some big marketing plan because you want to get those pilot test users on board, and those pilot test users should kind of be like low-hanging fruit for you. If you're building an app, then you should have some sort of experience related to the market or industry and some sort of market access that you can tap into, whether those be coworkers or colleagues or people in groups that you're in, whatever it may be. You should already have some form of existing access to this market. Even if it's on a smaller scale, that's okay. But that's who you're going to reach out to, and you're going to have conversations with those people when you are getting feedback in order to help you validate your product, right? You're going to have conversations with them that is going to essentially teach you how to speak their language. Marketing and messaging, really all this is understanding what matters to your target market and your prospective users. You want to learn about their pain points, you want to learn about their needs and their desires, and you want to learn how they talk about these things. So generally, you as the founder, if you're building an app, then like I said, you probably have industry experience, some sort of domain knowledge, and you probably talk about your app and it as a solution in a different way than your target market would. Generally, it's a little bit more technical, not related to app development specifically, but more technical in terms of your industry lingo, things like that. So you're probably going to talk about it a little bit more technically than your target market would. So you want to learn how they talk about it. And there's no better way to do that than by having conversations with them. And so when you're doing your pilot testing for your application to validate your product, you're going to be having conversations, and your goal with those conversations, aside from the product validation, should also be messaging validation. So what are the pain points your users have or your target market has? What are their desires and their needs? Not just from a technical standpoint as it relates to the solution you're building, but after that, if you consider your solution as the stepping stone to helping your target market achieve what they ultimately really want to achieve, what is that thing, right? What are you a stepping stone to, and how do they talk about it? The more you can understand how they talk about everything related to your app, the better you can create your own marketing and messaging, and the easier it's going to be for you to convert users in the future. Let's say down at this pilot stage, you're having those interviews or those conversations with your pilot test users, and you are really making sure that beyond just the product validation alone, you're also validating your messaging and learning how to formulate the best messaging. Well, that's really unscalable. Just like we talked about with the development side of things, having these conversations is a very unscalable thing because you only have so much time, right? But they give you an incredibly high return because you're literally talking to the exact people who you're going to be trying to sell your app to later on. So what you can do to add a component of scale is when you have those conversations and you learn that messaging, well, adding scale can be as simple as creating a high converting landing page. So you would essentially be taking everything you've learned from having those unscalable conversations and funneling that into a landing page that uses all the best messaging. So now you can create more scalable outreach because while you're still going to be doing manual outreach to your user or your target market as a whole, now instead of sending them to a scheduling page to book a meeting with you so they can be onboarded into your app, you can send them to a landing page that takes the messaging that you know is effective because you've had the conversations, and you can put that messaging on your landing page, and that can convert them into being a user, right? Because on the other side, well, you have created that automated onboarding. Okay, so now you're adding a little bit more scale on both sides and bringing those two together. Of course, that is still not as scalable as you want it to be, but you've gone through the pilot version, added some scale, and now you are in your beta version where your landing page is converting people instead of you being on a phone call. Well, from there, you can start taking all of that messaging and channeling it into some form of outreach. So whatever your chosen user acquisition channel is, now you can start funneling messaging into that on a one-to-many scale versus a one-to-one scale. So for example, let's say one of your user acquisition channels is Facebook. Okay, you could choose any social media platform. I mean, you could choose anything, but let's just say it's Facebook. Well, you can take the messaging that you have now tested and validated on those calls and then funneled into a landing page. And now, let's say you've seen that landing page converting people, so you've validated the effectiveness of that. Well, now you can start adding some more scale by putting that messaging out into Facebook groups, for example. Okay, so if that's one of your acquisition channels, then you take your messaging there. And so instead of reaching out to those low-hanging fruit users who you already have access to and who don't really take a lot of work to convert, well, now you can take messaging that you've tested and you've validated multiple times over, and you can take it to a more scalable platform. So you can now reach many people at one time versus one person at a time. And that's going to help you roll out the app. Now, adding another level of scale from there, well, as your outreach on that initial channel becomes more effective, well, now you can take that you've now validated because it is converting users, and you can apply it to a new user acquisition channel, a new outreach channel. So going with social media still, maybe you take it from Facebook and you now apply it to LinkedIn as well. So now you're creating even more scale because you've found what you've tested and validated as you've climbed this ladder, and you're now applying that to another platform, another acquisition channel that's only going to help you scale up more. At every single rung of the ladder, essentially what you're trying to do is add more leverage for yourself on both the development side and the messaging and marketing sales side. Let's talk about what that looks like here. So I'm going to extend the rungs of our ladder here so we can sort of draw it out. So at the bottom, right, in this pilot stage, you are really doing low leverage work, but it's giving you a very high return. Low leverage work meaning it's very manual, so there's not a lot of leverage there with your time, but a very high return because you're having one-on-one conversations with people, and there's nothing more valuable, right? There's no better way to get information from people than, by talking to them face to face. Now, as you move up to both your beta and your rollout stages, it starts to kind of even out here. So we'll apply both the same on both stages. So you kind of have like a medium leverage here, medium return, right? Medium leverage, medium return. And I say medium leverage because we've added a couple components of scale as we move up. And I say medium return because there's nothing more valuable than interacting with a user one-on-one, right? There's just not. There's no better way to bring a user through your app than to literally take them by the hand, maybe not literally, but then to take them by the hand and go through. Okay, so your return in the feedback that you're getting and the validation that you're getting, right? And even with the growth with your business, it's not going to be as high because it's not one-on-one in the way that it was previously, but that's okay. And you'll see why in just a second. But once we get to the top here, you are now at a really high leverage point, but a lower return point. And this might seem bad, but it's not, because this is a lower individual return. Okay, so when you are at scale, again, you can't be having one-on-one conversations with every single prospective user, obviously depending on your app's use case, but in general, that's just not going to happen. And so you're going to be relying on, if we look back at our example of the social media outreach, well, that's going to give you a much lower return. Putting up a social media post that is meant to drive users to your app, it's going to give you a much lower return than if you were to reach out to an existing contact who you have and have a conversation with them and try to convert them into a user, right? One is much more effective than the other, right? But one is much less leveraged than the other. So you're going to have a lower individual return once you get up here, but you're going to have a vastly higher gross return. Okay, because now we are doing outreach, right, at scale, at a very large scale. And so your gross return is going to outweigh that individual return. I want to zoom in here just to make sure you can see all of this, but essentially we're climbing the ladder here. Pilot, beta, rollout, scale. We're testing and we're validating at every single stage, and we're adding scale as we come up. When you start at this lower stage, you're going to be low leveraged, but you're going to be having a high return. And that's going to start to tip as you move up, and then it's going to invert once you get to the top. But once you get to the top, you're going to have that high gross return. If you have been feeling held back because you can't figure out what those later stages are going to look like, that's how you're going to climb up and out. But know that in these early stages, you can't have crystal clarity on what those exact later stages are going to look like. So you have to understand how it's going to happen, and that will allow you to get there. So you have to start at that first rung of the ladder and start to climb up. But know, and this is the important part, know that it's going to be unscalable in the beginning. Okay, so if you see all these other apps and companies and entrepreneurs out there, and it seems like they're living the high life and they're not, like they just have this wildly successful business, and how the heck do you get there? Well, if you look at the past 3, 5, 10 plus years, right, you're going to see exactly this. You're going to see that they started in an incredibly unscalable way. Now, the allure of launching an app is that an app-based business model is so scalable. That is the most scalable, right? And if you have an existing business that is not based around an app, building an app for your business is going to add so much more scale, right? And so you can come into it and sort of get caught up with that. And that's not bad, as long as you understand that it's going to start in a much less scalable place. If you are wanting to make sure you are building the right product and actually moving up to that next rung of the ladder correctly, then you can head to coachingnocodeapps.com/perfect-pilot. You'll see that link on the screen. I'll drop it down in the description below. Go there, grab the free template and the free training, and create your roadmap to help you climb that ladder. It's going to systematically scope out your app so you can know exactly what you should be developing, so that you're not aiming for that scale point way too early and missing out on all the valuable information in between. So coachingnocodeapps.com/perfect-pilot. And hey, if you found this video helpful for you, give it a like down below. We'd really appreciate it. It helps us help more people launch their apps and their businesses. All right, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.